Well, here we are, Renee, and we have a guest today. Tell me what we're doing.
Well, we have your friend Megan's coming to join us today, and we're going to be talking all about mental health first aid and talking about HR and how we need to have a training program and an understanding of how to make sure that people's mental health is dealt with correctly in the workplace. And I'm pretty excited for this conversation. So, Jason, what's happening on the farm before we kick this off?
Well, I think it's only appropriate. I went to a 90-minute webinar on fences and who's responsible for upkeeping fences, how you put a fence up. This is really interesting. It was an attorney that talked all about it, right? And you know what?
Mhm.
Boundaries are important, right? And I learned that if I send a letter to my neighbors, they have to cover half of the fence. It's the law in Iowa. It dates back to the 1800s.
Hmm.
And you know what? That might seem unfair, right? Because I'm like, wait a minute, my neighbor can send me a letter and I'm responsible for 50% of the cost. That's a fact. And so I guess I didn't know that going into it because I have some fences that are in disrepair on my property. And I'm thinking about what should I do? Can I just go rip it out? Do I need permission to do that? But you know what? It's a boundary. And I think we're going to talk a little about work today and setting good boundaries and whether there's actually a fence there, whether it's a partition fence or a boundary fence, we all need to think about how we set boundaries. And sometimes I've taken a lot of fences out because I don't have livestock. I just have row crops and it doesn't keep the deer out anyway. But there's still a boundary there. And so I think today, let's talk boundaries, Renee and Megan, because I think that's what it's all about.
I just have so many thoughts at the moment. Anyone that would do 90 minutes of a webinar for a fence, you're a special person. I'm just saying.
I
I
tied it
live,
together for this episode, too. You got to give me some
yeah,
credit.
you did. That's nicely done. But 90 minutes about fencing. I mean, come on now. I live in an HOA. We don't even have fences. All right. So,
But do you have boundaries? This is what we're going to dig into because
oh,
that
yes.
is what it's all about.
Yes. Boundaries, yes. Fences, not so much. All right. Let's bring on our guest today. Megan, would you just introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you came from, and why are you joining us today? What are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, thank you, Renee and Jason. Great intro, and thanks for having me on. So, my name is Megan Hammis, and I'm the owner of Hammis Homestead and Consulting, and I focus on mental health training in the workplace. I'm fairly new to the world of entrepreneurship, having started my business about 1 year ago. Prior to that, I worked in higher education in Iowa for about 20 years and I ran our employee health and well-being programs for a little over 20,000 full-time employees at the institution I was at. And that was an awesome job, awesome role. One of the things I absolutely loved about my work in employee health and well-being, well, there were many things that I loved, but especially teaching and training and educating. And as my role grew and expanded and changed, I found myself doing less and less of some of that. So that's certainly a part of my journey towards entrepreneurship and now going out to lots of different businesses and doing mental health education trainings. But that's just kind of a quick overview of why I'm here today.
Well, that's
Well, we're so
awesome,
glad
And
to
how
have
did you
you.
stumble across us? Megan, I think we've been friends on LinkedIn for a while. I think we've kind of done
Yep.
similar work. You're on another part of the state, and so I think, I've kind of
Yep.
known you and heard great things about you over the years. But how did we get connected? Just
Yep.
remind me.
I will. Yeah. So I want to give a shout out to both of you for your podcast. So when I started teaching a course called Mental Health First Aid, and we'll get more into, what that class is and who it's for, but taught my first class in August of 2023. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in mental health first aid is what to do if there's a crisis situation. And for mental health first aiders, it's always get professional help. And one of the ways that professional help comes to us is by calling the 988 National Crisis Line. So, just as a part of my own research as an instructor, I wanted to find out, in Iowa, especially because that's where a majority, not all, but a majority of my trainings have been. What does our state look like kind of behind the scenes in terms of, well, what's going to happen after I call 988? And so the two of you had a podcast on the community behavioral health centers, maybe last fall, is when I ran across that. And so I listened to that just for my own knowledge and education and subscribed to your podcast. So I've been listening ever since last fall. And then Jason is a part of my kind of research or due diligence as a mental health first aid instructor. I have also been reaching out to other instructors in Iowa just to, meet them, learn a little bit about how they work, what they do. And then it's also really nice just to know who other mental health first aid instructors are, especially locally if we need help, just having a bench of people to be able to tag. So yeah, so I reached out to you. We had a meeting and here I am.
It's fantastic. So let's just jump right in, right? Let's talk about employee well-being in the workplace, right? I'm a big advocate of mental health first aid as well. I think, Renee, we've talked a little bit about mental health first aid on previous podcasts of just how important training is. So tell us a little bit about, how you intertwine training, and how you got drawn into mental health first aid, Megan.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'd like to start with just employee well-being in the workplace, because it's so much easier said than done. And I know we kind of, joked around at the beginning of using the analogy of a fence to boundaries and the importance of setting boundaries, but that's a lot easier said than done because of the culture. So I'm sure, Jason, you could make an analogy to the culture with the neighbors and the fencing and where all of that sits. But I will, first and foremost, just give a shout out to our U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. In the fall of 2022, he came out with what I believe will be referred to as a landmark report on the importance of the workplace for health, the health of our nation, really. It goes as far to talk about the workplace as a driver of, even national security, kind of linking it, the health of our nation, to something as important and serious as national security. So he talks about when he grew up, his parents were doctors and they worked in a medical clinic. And that was really their community. They would bring meals to people they knew were having a rough time or who were sick. They would know the children of the patients and they would all kind of play together. So there was this community feel to the work. And it was really this beautiful picture of like working really, really hard, but also having it be a good thing. It provides financial means for our family. It provides this community and support. And so then in his report, he kind of goes on to say, hey, workplaces, we're not doing a great job of this anymore. Some of our programs, our policies, our shifts, our practices, our focus on profit are diminishing these very positive aspects of the workplace. So it talks about the importance of a healthy wage, the importance of community and connection. And it's a great report. And I know how it goes. People are too busy to read, a 60-some page report, especially if it's something they're not familiar with. But really talks about it's not just behaviors of the employee. So meaning I'll get to the training, but it's not just going to be training and educating your employees. First and foremost, a supportive work environment that really allows people to be able to learn and to be healthy and to be well. So first, just kind of want to acknowledge that the work environment and the culture is critical. And we can talk more about, well, what does that even mean? What are some things that workplaces should be doing to support that? But where the education, training, and prevention comes in is, really great workplaces want their employees to learn and grow. It's not come in on day one, and then when you leave at the end of your career, the same amount of stuff. I mean, humans should be growing, they should be learning. And mental health challenges are everywhere. 1 in 4 to 5 adults in our country experiences a mental health challenge in any year. So they're very common. And so workplaces that do education and training are just helping employees understand, hey, mental health challenges are common. We want to provide some facts and some education, because when people have facts and education, that can help reduce stigma. It can help open the door to having conversations around mental health. Mental health first aid training uses the really parallel track to physical health. You know, how is our mental health different from our physical health? Our brain is a part of our body. We really should be able to talk about our needs from a mental health standpoint just as much as we talk about our needs from a physical health standpoint. So that's kind of where the training comes in. It improves the culture, normalizes conversation, reduces stigma and bias, so on and so forth.
I love what you said about what's the workplace's responsibility, and so we do have a link to this, and I do encourage you to jump over and take a link and look at those 5 essentials for a workplace of mental health and well-being. And one that comes to mind is earlier in this summer, I was up volunteering for some of the disasters as part of the disaster behavioral health response team. And I look at protection from harm, and I think about, you said it's more than just a training, right? It's about how do workplaces support their employees, especially in times of a disaster. As we look at weather events that have occurred across the Midwest this summer, I sat with one person and she had just started a new job, and she said all of her fellow coworkers had pitched in their PTO for her, but the most her employer was going to give her was 3 days of paid time off. She just lost her house in a flood. She was using that entire 3 days to go from the disaster response to fill out the FEMA paperwork and then to fill out the state paperwork. And those things all happened between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m., which is when she was supposed to be at her work site. And so we think about mental health and emotional well-being in the workplace, we have to think about all of the components that a person needs to be supported and successful. And that goes to retention, right? If this
Yep.
person can't meet her basic needs, then she's probably not going to be retained. And she's a fantastic employee who's just trying to get her feet back underneath of her. And so I think that's really important when we think about this to think of the big picture is what's the employer's larger strategy of how do they support people, right? Emotional well-being includes housing and all of those other parts that
Yeah.
person has as part of them. Just made me think of that when you were talking, Megan.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example. And it, kind of staying on the lines of natural disaster. I live in Eastern Iowa. And so 4 years ago, we were especially impacted by the derecho. And there are some people in mental health first aid training when we talk about the definition of trauma and what different things might be traumatic for someone. We all experience it differently. People still tear up when they think about the derecho, whether they have been impacted directly or indirectly, because it was so severe. And so also keeping in mind, I think we're really good in our state, especially in this immediate time, this really critical time after something happens. But what about 4 years later? How are we kind of acknowledging people's processing? Because moving can be very traumatic, especially if it's forced move, right? So that's a great example. And then other examples might even include things like major life changes, like welcoming a baby into the home for men and for women. That's a game changer if you're a parent. And so kind of, expecting that over the course of someone's tenure at a company, they are going to change throughout that, right? Like we said, we want them to learn and grow and have more knowledge. We also should expect that the needs of our employees are going to change. And so how can we react and adapt to that in a way that's very equitable across our workforce? So there's some policies and guardrails in place, but it also feels really supportive for people. It's psychologically safe for people to talk about what their needs are, whether seen or unseen.
Well, and that's really a great segue into the training piece, right? That's what mental health awareness training is all about. And,
Yeah.
we have another link to mental health awareness trainings, right? Because there's a number of different validated quality mental health awareness trainings, right? It's not just going out and finding somebody and saying, hey, can you do an hour on this thing, right? What Megan does with mental health first aid, and we look at some of the other opportunities. Renee and I have had the opportunity to do NAMI provider for physicians, and so there's lots of really great trainings out there. And so let's talk a little about how important is it to bring mental health awareness to all employees? And, as a subset, especially supervisors, right? Because who do most employees go to? Who is the first person in most organizations that have those difficult conversations with employees? In my experience, in doing those trainings and being in the corporate world, it's supervisors who are least well equipped I look at a lot of organizations. Who becomes a supervisor? The person who's there the longest, right? The person that's still there gets promoted to be a supervisor, not necessarily because they've been trained as being supportive and understanding and know HR policies and procedures. So Megan, tell me the importance of educating everyone in an organization, especially those supervisors.
Yeah, absolutely. I so empathize with supervisors. I really do. They have so much responsibility oftentimes. And you're exactly right. They're often the first to know and recognize when there's been a change. When a company asks me, who should I send through the training? I'm like, well, that's up to you. I believe that like first aid and CPR, where many members of the general public are trained to respond to a physical health emergency, a mental health training, it's really for anyone. So I advise, as you mentioned, supervisors, human resources professionals, because they're often clued in when there's a nexus to a leave or an illness or performance attendance issues. So supervisors, human resources, but then also just those people connectors. And I don't have a great word for them, but just the people who are the social people. In some organizations, there's a keeper of the conference room reservation or the orderer of the catering. Those people that know everyone, and then there's also people who this is very second nature to, because I think there is just a difference in people who are very comfortable having these conversations. So when you say, you ask open-ended questions, learn a little bit more, they're like, oh yeah, easy. I do that all day, every day anyway. And then there's other people that are like, could you please provide me with a script? I would like to know exactly what I am supposed to say. Anyway, back to the question focused specifically on supervisors, providing them with facts around mental health and mental illness. So, what are certain conditions? What are certain signs and symptoms? Probably even more importantly, to notice. What are some changes to look for? So that if you notice a change in someone, you feel comfortable bringing it up. It might be a change in work patterns or style. It might be a change in how someone is appearing. It might be a change in showing up late to meetings when they used to be early to meetings, volunteering for things and now they're not. Just these subtle changes that, sometimes a supervisor is that first one to notice that it's okay to bring them up. Where I came from and kind of how I was taught is, we just don't, those are personal things. You don't talk about them. And I see that a lot, that we still are like, just keep that out. But if we're expecting people to bring their whole selves to work, and we want a kind and caring culture, we do want to equip and train our supervisors that it's absolutely okay to bring up these things. Now, how somebody responds, we can't control that. They might say, stay out of my business. They can say that. They might say, thanks for asking. It's just this minor thing. I got this fence argument going on with a neighbor. It's going to get resolved. Or they might say, thanks for asking. I have no idea what's going on, but I think it's something really serious. And I think I'd like to look into it. Supervisor, awesome. How can I support you? What do we need to do here?
Renee, do you want to get a word in edgewise? Because we haven't let you speak at all.
You guys are just on a roll, so it's been good. But a lot of this is just reminding me of my own office and my own office settings. And one of the seasons that our office is in is a lot of grief and loss. We've lost of the employees I have. There's only 11 of us in the office, and I think 6 have lost a parent in the last 2 years. And just due to in different ages, different issues and different reasons. And so there really are a lot of things. And I also have a very diverse group as far as ages are concerned. So I have people that are up into we're almost retired into that boomer category, all the way down into my millennial Gen Z intern. And it makes just for a really interesting dynamic about all of these issues. And so I could see where training would be really helpful, just getting the same language around issues and people understanding what we're talking about. Because for some people, and specifically my office, would be never caught dead speaking of any of these issues in the building, where the younger folks, I'm seeing that they won't want to work somewhere where you don't speak about it. And so it's a very, very different time right now. We're not in the season where people just didn't speak about issues in the workplace anymore. So it's a good time to be talking about this. And I know, Jason, I know that you had some stories about some of the people you've worked with where the older generation that are the owners of businesses were just not understanding why we needed to bring mental health into the workplace. And so this is, I mean, I'm grateful that Megan's working on this because it's such a big issue and it's so prevalent all across businesses of all types right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It does make me think about, Megan, how do you engage leadership, right? Because what I have found is I need someone from the executive team or I need a decision maker in those trainings to hear the real life benefit from the employees and the supervisors. Because without buy-in from leadership, how do we make sure policies align? You talked about it's more than a training.
Yeah.
Well, if it's more than a training, then policies and practice have to align with putting the employee first, right? Kind of going back to that PTO conversation of what can we do when someone loses their house in a flood? Do we want to retain that employee? Do we want to be human in our workplace? And so how do we engage leadership?
Yeah, well, I think leaders absolutely do understand the connection. I think they're getting hammered, for lack of a better term, on mental health in the workplace. I also observe that, leaders didn't get into their position of company president or owner of the company because they were focused on mental health. They probably have a background in business, in finance, they're a subject matter expert. That's awesome. So I also see them just kind of being like, HR, employee health and safety manager, help. I need help. I'm all ears here. I think what I'm observing is they very much want to invest. They want to do the right thing. And at the same time, they're running a company. I mean, they've got a lot on their plate, right? So, the groups I'm working with, the willing, right? Nobody must hire me to come in. So that's also a luxury that I have, but I think they're, seeking this. And so I don't think it's hard really to engage them. I think the key is really, I worked in HR for almost 20 years. And so I know that they also have so many plates spinning and so much. There's probably things that companies are doing that are supportive of mental health and well-being that they don't even kind of think of as being supportive. So I'll give you some examples because this is what I talk about when I get the ear of a leader or an HR person or a safety person, because a lot of safety managers are kind of being challenged with, hey, what are we doing around employee mental health? And some of that is the connection to suicide rates in certain industries that are much higher than the general population, and that often falls to safety for whatever reason. But work hours and schedule predictability. So if a company says, well, yeah, employees know when they show up and when they leave, that is actually extremely helpful for mental health. But if employees don't know when they get to leave and they don't know when they're expected to come in tomorrow, that is very damaging for mental health. Workload is another issue. This is one that I think is challenging for leaders because leaders have an appetite, generally. Owners, leaders, presidents have an appetite for a very heavy workload. They might have a different balance than a lot of us between life outside of work and life inside of work. Most employees that I know that are on the front line are like, I want a reasonable workload for my 40-hour work week. Like, I want it to be boxed in here and I don't need a lot of extra. If my kiddo has an appointment or I have an appointment, you mentioned a lot of things happen between the hours of 8 and 4:30. I don't want to take a whole day off and burn through a vacation day. I just want to cut out 2 hours early to make my appointment. Can I have that intermittent flexibility? Oh, you know what? I got a wait list called an opening tomorrow for my derm appointment that guess what? Next available appointment is March 2025. Awesome. I should take that. Can I just leave tomorrow? I don't have any meetings. So that intermittent flexibility is huge for employees. And then paid time off. Many of us take for granted the fact that if we do take some of this time off, it's going to be unpaid hours. And some of our workers, especially low wage earners, if you take time off, you're not getting paid. And that is detrimental to employee health and well-being, because then they're not going to take that derm appointment that they probably need to get to. They're going to wait 9 months. And we know what can happen from a preventive health standpoint if we don't get seen early. So paid leave is also huge. And then having covered mental health and health benefits. So a lot of times an employee goes through open enrollment. They're not a benefits expert. They don't necessarily know what they're signing up for. So I advise company leadership and HR minimum of once a month, remind your employees of certain key things for, health and well-being that they have access to. HR knows it, you know, front and back. They talk about it all the time, but the general employee, keep that information in front of them, because when somebody needs it, they need it. They're probably not going to go back and sift through a bunch of paperwork from their benefits open enrollment. So kind of keeping those great company and local resources front and center for employees, even if they're not using it right away, it sends a message that we care and these things are available to you. So that kind of hits the leadership side of things, just about you're probably already doing a lot of these things. So just kind of remind employees and communicate the great policies that are in place that do help support health and
The
well-being.
number one rule I tell everyone is over communicate. These are
Yeah.
all things that absolutely you need to over communicate, because people aren't going to need it until they need it. And keeping those things in the forefront are amazing. I think it's important to note that if you're out there listening to us and saying, I wish my company would do this, or I wish I had an HR department that could get the ear of their leadership. I've also been on the flip side of some organizations that, it takes a year before they kind of decide that they want to bring someone in, and then to make the commitment that, a 7.5 hour training for 30 people, that's going to cost us a lot. And sometimes it's a process, right? And so we want to also remind people that it's important, right? And we're going to have a bunch of links that we put in the notes of this podcast. If you want to learn more about how can you sell this to your leadership, how can you have more conversations, do that. Don't get discouraged, because, everyone can be on the same page, but sometimes it takes time, depending on how complicated and complex your organization is, how big it is. I've worked with some Fortune 500 companies, right? And it takes a long time sometimes to make a commitment, right? And sometimes it starts with the training, once a year, and they're like, we need to do this more because we can see the benefits across the entire organization. Wow, but we got to get approval from so and so to do that, right? But thinking about, as long as you're starting somewhere, right? That's part of the advocacy piece of this, is telling that story and moving it
Yep.
forward, right? And that's why this conversation is so important, is how do you bring light to these things in your organization and start showing the benefit of this? This has a benefit in retention. It has a benefit in how we view our workplace. All of those things matter moving forward.
Yeah. So Megan, before I go into my self-care policy of the week, is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about you or the work you do, or maybe tell them how they can find you if they want to dive in more and know more about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. One thing that I did want to hit on is in the workplace, one of the catalysts for people reaching out to me is often, unfortunately, an employee or a family member of an employee dying by suicide. And so the work that I do with training is really designed to be so much more upstream, to recognize mental health challenges early on so that we can get connected to care sooner. And at the same time, I'm very grateful that, something is motivating companies to, reach out and really want to try to learn more. It's a very hard topic for a lot of people to talk about, but trainings, believe it or not, can be, actually kind of fun to think about. That's one thing I've heard from a lot of participants is, I didn't expect a training where we learn about and talk about mental health to actually be fun. You talked about the multi-generational workforces, and trainings aren't designed to make people change their behaviors. They're really just designed to increase knowledge. So that person that says, I wouldn't be caught dead talking about my mental health in the office, that's okay. We're not telling you you have to now, but you're probably going to learn something and maybe understand why some other people are. But in the workplace, I mentioned the topic of suicide. 78% of all suicides are working aged males. So I have found myself since starting my own business in the last year, and this wasn't necessarily my intent, but the universe is funny this way. um, Being very drawn to construction and manufacturing industries. My husband works in construction. My dad and my brother worked in manufacturing settings, so like kind of like 24/7 manufacturing environment. So I have a little bit of a blue collar heart, if you will. And these are some of the industries that I see kind of almost appreciating the trainings the most, are these like tough male dominated organizations. And they're like, wow, this is important. So I think that's really great. In terms of finding me, I am on LinkedIn, Megan Hammis. So you can look me up if you're on LinkedIn, or my website, which is hammisconsulting.com. Mental health first aid instructor and myself are working right now on a virtual training specifically for managers, supervisors, and leaders in the manufacturing and construction settings. So we will be offering a course at the end of August, in September, and another one in November. So that will be up very soon at my website. So if that's interesting to people and they'd like to join that, they can reach out. That might be desirable for companies that aren't quite ready yet. As Jason said, sometimes it's a heavy lift in terms of pulling people off the floor or out of work for a full day or perhaps 2 half days, if you will. So this might be an opportunity to send just, one or two people to a training to kind of check it out, and then do some recon and bring it back to the company to decide, do we want to do this for more of our own employees? Yeah, and then, mental health first aid is one of the trainings that has probably the most research behind it. That's why I instruct that primarily. A lot of research and data from all over the world. It started in Australia, but is in over 25 countries now. But then question, persuade, refer, or QPR is another very evidence-based training, and QPR is specifically around suicide prevention. And QPR can be done in 60 to 90 minutes. So it is shorter and it's much more focused on the topic of suicide prevention. There are many other trainings, but those are the two that I think kind of fit the workplace the best in terms of just the amount of time, the topics that are covered.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And we'll make sure that all your contact information is in our show notes so that everybody can find you. Well, now is the time we come for our recovering politician self-care tip of the week. And we're going back to the basics, people. I don't know about you, but I get all off on my sleep in the summer. I end up staying up too late, especially around the 4th of July. And then it just sort of goes into the summer because it's light outside longer and I don't get my routine. And I track my sleep every day. And right now they're like, you're going to bed too late. And I'm getting little notifications and I'm messing around. And I know that if I don't get enough sleep, I'm a mess. I don't know about everybody else, but I have found that sleep is one of my most important things for keeping me on the straight and narrow and to be less stressed and less anxious in life. And so I myself am going back to the basics and going to get back to bed on time. So Jason, did you have any thoughts on self-care for you this week in the summer? Because I know it's a long, hot summer
Well,
where you
you triggered a thought that, earlier this summer, I talked about my wife and I got new beds. We got a new bed because it was time, right? And so one thing we haven't adapted to, and I'm still working on it, is there's sensors that turn these lights on underneath it because that's how they are now. And so every time the dog moves, the underlighting comes on. And so the dog will walk around the bed and both sides have separate lighting. This might just be a me problem. I'm not sure.
It's a you problem. Once
exactly.
again, Jason, we've landed in a you problem, but that would be really distracting and I'd be awake all night. And so I think that would be a problem I would undo.
But then you don't trip when you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, then the lights automatically come on. It's calming. No, this might just be a problem Jennifer
it's a
and
you
I
thing.
have.
Sorry
Okay.
about this. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Megan Hamas, for being with us. You're amazing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And yes, construction is one of the highest suicide rates in the state and in the country. And so I'm really grateful you're working with that group of folks in manufacturing and on the construction world, because wow, they've got a lot of needs, and that's an important demographic to be working with. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We talked about how you could get your program started in the workplace. If there's something that you want to do, all of Megan's information is going to be in our show notes. We're excited that she was here with us today. If you have any questions, please reach out. Both she and Jason both teach mental health first aid, and then QPR we talked about earlier as well. So if you need some help, please reach out. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again next time.